Yeah, welcome very much to Conversations. This segment of the program is with a Ph.D., Brian DeAugustino. He's written in the book you can see here on the podium is a book called, it's got a very interesting title, and it's called The Middle Class Fights Back, subtitled How Progressive Movements Can Restore Democracy in America. Very interesting theme. And Brian, welcome very much to Conversations.
Thank you.
Okay, we'd like to do it. I'm happy to meet you, first time we've met and so forth. And I wonder if you could, Brian, for ourselves and the audience, just share your own background in terms of born and raised a little bit and education. And then we'll get into talking about how the middle class can fight back, a very interesting theme that you've written on.
Right. Well, I grew up in a suburb of New York City, Yonkers and White Plains.
Oh, yeah, Seven Hills.
Yeah. And came to New York in 1972 when I went to Columbia College, and I've lived on the Upper West Side ever since.
Okay.
And then I did a Ph.D. at Columbia in political science.
In political science, okay.
I worked for about 11 years as a New York City public school teacher.
Oh, really? Good for you. What level?
I taught high school.
High school
math and social studies. I had two certifications.
Does it make a difference as a high school teacher where you were teaching in that? What was it? Stuyvesant as one or Bronx?
Well, I taught for a couple of years in one of the magnet schools, a smaller one called the High School for Math, Science, and Engineering. And yeah, you had a very different population there than you did in most public schools. And I've taught in more traditional public schools as well.
Yeah.
But I have, you know, based on that experience, I got a picture of about half of my tenure in the school system was under Giuliani, and then midway through those 11 years, it was when Mayor Bloomberg got control of the school system. So I got to see the effects of his reforms firsthand, and I talk about that in some detail in my book.
Oh, okay. Oh, you do talk about it. Okay, well, we can get into that in the book. What did you do the dissertation on in political science?
Right. So my Ph.D. work was in the psychology of militarism.
Wow. And interesting and timely, yeah.
Yeah, right. And I did a survey of the Council on Foreign Relations.
Oh, wow.
Which is an elite organization of academics, government officials, corporate executives that are the shakers and movers of American foreign policy.
Right.
And so my advisor, Roger Hilsman, was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations.
I think I know that name.
He was an assistant secretary of state under John Kennedy.
Okay, yeah.
And so that gave me access to the Council on Foreign Relations, and I did a survey on self-images of hawks and doves, how the self-psychology of people who support more military power, unlimited military power, and those who see military power as something that needs to be reined in.
The realpolitik people.
Right.
Yeah, I know. I've been doing some programs over there and so forth. And then it's sort of aligned with the Trilateral Commission, is that correct? Or
well,
they're both two parts of the
they're different
established order,
Yeah, the Trilateral Commission, I think, more is connected to the economic policy, and the council is more foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy.
That's right. The major voice, I would think, in terms of the established military view of things. So that's interesting. You've done that, and then you've taught in the school system. We could go into a long discussion. The trouble is, John, I'm so interested. I mean, Brian, I'm so interested in everything. I could go into details on all of those kind of things. But we do want to get down to your current work and so forth. And what prompted you to write the book, The Middle Class Fights Back, and give us a little background on it, if you could.
Right. Well, you know, actually it's interesting because it arises out of these two big pieces of my background. When I was working as a public school teacher, especially under Mayor Bloomberg, I began to realize that there's like a disconnect between these two worlds where, on the one hand, we have urban public education, which serves the poor, but largely the poor in New York City and other big metropolitan areas. And there's the lack of resources in urban public schools, the fiscal neglect of urban public schools, contrasted in my mind with what is now about $1 trillion a year that's spent on the national security state.
I'll be down. Yes.
And it's not just the military budget. I mean, it's a vast apparatus, and it's all justified in the name of terrorism, when in reality most of the most of those resources go into traditional military programs that have little to do with security from terrorism. But the point is that there's a fiscal priorities in this country that are remarkably warped. And so I became aware of this as a teacher, struggling with the poor, and then thinking about what I had done my dissertation research on, this military-industrial complex, this permanent war economy, and the vast resources, and the discrepancy between those resources and the poor. So what does this have to do with the middle class? Well,
that's what I was thinking. If I may for a minute,
so
like I'm a little older. I'm from Detroit, and so in the public school system, I had never associated in my mind the public school system with the poor. It was all levels of society, and then you had some. You had some private schools or prep schools or something that would serve the overwhelmingly wealthy. But public schools, I didn't associate with the poor. I associated it with a lot of the middle class or even upper middle class, and, really an effective part of the whole social order.
Well,
you associate it with the poor. Is it New York you're talking about?
Let me make a distinction.
You understand what I'm saying?
No, of course. I'm mainly talking about big urban public school systems like New York. Now, this is interesting because there was a time that the New York City public school system served the upper middle class.
City University was free of any tuition.
Well, but I'm talking about the K-12 system that was oriented to the upper middle class at one time.
It was.
It was, yes. And in those days also.
What days was it?
Well, certainly in the first half of the 20th century, I would say.
It was, really? Okay.
And probably before that as well. I'm not an historian of the public school system. But certainly in recent decades, there has been a tendency for suburban schools to be where if you have a middle class, and I guess this had something to do with white flight after the war, suburbanization, and then you had an exodus of many suburban families, and in those suburban school districts, the pay is good and the class sizes are relatively small. And so there's really two public school systems.
I see, and I can see like something like New York, urban,
So what disturbs me is that we have a larger political economy. Now this gets to the middle class. I talked about the vast resources going into the military and then the fiscal neglect of the poor. So where does the middle class fit in here? Well, the middle class historically has tended to identify itself with the rich in the United States in this sense, in the sense that there was this belief that if ordinary people work hard, you can come from, humble beginnings. If ordinary people work hard and if they're frugal, they will be able to get rich or at least prosper.
Well, also also in the experience, if I may, after the Second World War, when we emerged triumphant, we had a decades-long period of just unprecedented growth, where endless numbers of people who had been poor or working or agricultural family farm were able to have a steady increase in net worth and growth. It was just a tremendous growth that seemed to go on forever.
Well, that's right. What period did you have in mind there?
Well, I was just thinking after leading out of the Depression and into the 30s and the 40s, and after the war we emerged triumphant, and it was just a golden age. A guy could go to work in a factory and put his kids all through college and all kinds of security and everything, and everything seems to have gone into hell in a handbasket in the intervening period for some reason that we want to get back to.
Well, that's right. And my book addresses exactly my book addresses exactly what you were talking about, which could be maybe called the rise and fall of the middle class.
Rise and fall of.
Well, the rise of the middle. There was always a middle class in the United States, but until actually the organized labor in the 1930s and government programs like New Deal programs and going back before that the programs of the progressive era, it was actually pretty rough going for ordinary Americans. Farmers faced downward pressure on their crop prices. Meanwhile, they were squeezed by monopoly, transportation, and banks, and so there was the average American was working very hard and not really prospering the way we would consider a middle class standard of living today.
Well, it was
before the rise of organized labor in the 1930s.
Yeah, the 30s. Yeah, I was from Detroit, right?
Right.
And we had my granddaddy was a labor organizer, but there wasn't any labor organizing at the turn of the 1920s. He was a guild. It was a guild as a lithographer.
Right.
And everything. But then the labor and in turn of the century, it was the largest employment was a family farm, 35% of the population, and the second was domestic help. And then by the term, there came combines and whatnot, industrialization. Right. They all came to Detroit and got jobs in Henry Ford's River Rouge plant.
Right. Right.
And so there was that kind of a dynamic in the 20th century that was going. And then there came the Great Depression, and then the war came, got us out of it, and then it was just glory for a while. Right. And when did that stop? Was it PAPCO? Was it Reagan?
Well, it was really beginning with Reagan in 1980, and actually beginning in the 70s, corporations began to shut down unionized plants in the Northeast, which then came to be called the Rust Belt, right?
Yeah, right.
And started to move to the Sun Belt, to the south, to the west, where they were using non-union labor. And
right, that was part of the Southern strategy.
Well, that's right. That began in the 70s.
Nixon,
okay, so this attack on wages and benefits, in Chapter 2 in my book, I talk about the attack on wages and benefits.
Right,
and how it was really organized labor that created the middle class as we know it. Organized labor and programs like the New Deal. And then beginning in the 70s, U.S. corporations began to shut down their unionized plants and move to the Sun Belt and eventually out of the country altogether.
Michigan just voted right to work.
Yes, right.
A couple of days ago or something.
That's right. And that's a continuation of an attack on wages and benefits that's been going on since the 1970s, really.
I just did a discussion. You just met him, Kai Hayner, which Kai Hayner talking about Henry George and so forth, and Lord Keynes we got to talking about, Lord John Maynard Keynes, who set up all the things from Bretton Woods and all that, and also came, and he predicted, I just wonder what you think, it's maybe sidebar, but he predicted in the letters to his grandchildren in 1930.
Keynes?
Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, the sage of all the institutional structures, World Bank, International Monetary Fund and everything, and he predicted that for that generation of his grandchildren, 1930, in their maturity about now, there's going to be massive technologically induced structural unemployment.
Right.
Do you remember that? And I wonder if that is, and yet we have employment as the way in which the gains that were made by the labor unions and so forth made possible the middle class that was doing very, very well. And yet there's going to be this structural unemployment which may be coming into place because the technology is displacing labor. Is that something that influences your thinking or your question of what's happening to the middle class?
No, absolutely. And this really gets a little bit also to the decline of the middle class. And really, to some extent, it also has to do with the decline of the productive engine of the American economy.
Okay.
Now, so you talk about, for example, automation, right? And a lot of advances have been occurring in manufacturing, and manufacturing productivity continues to go up, has always gone up, and has continued to go up in recent decades. But an ominous development, and this really undermines the middle class, has been that the United States has had a balance of trade deficit. For decades. And so
you got offshoring too.
Right. Right. And so therefore a lot of manufactured goods, we really have a net balance of trade deficit that cannot be rectified through services. There's this mentality that the United States now has a service economy or a post-industrial economy. And in reality, manufactured goods are necessary in every sector.
Sure.
You know, construction, agriculture, all manner of services require manufactured goods of one kind or another. Medicine requires imaging equipment.
Sure.
So we cannot, the United States has to produce most of the manufactured goods and machines that we use. Most of them have to be produced here.
Yeah, they do some assembly abroad often because you get a cost cutting, yeah.
Right, well, not just assembly, but also manufacturing abroad. Now, ironically, now it's some Asian and European manufacturers are coming here because
I guess that's right.
We're now at the point where our wages are, we're like, our manufacturing wages are like 15th in the world. So American workers are now like a bargain for for Europeans and Japanese companies who have higher industrial wages.
Ironic, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, it is ironic, but it's also disturbing because now the middle class is getting whittled away, whittled down. Corporations are going to the lowest bidder. It's a race to the bottom. And we need some kind of structural change, which is one of the, so one of the themes that I address in my book is how we change. What do we do to fight back? How do we fight this? And I have specific policy ideas in my book about this.
It says how progressive movements can restore democracy in America. That's sort of a big order of thinking.
Right.
And very called for, and also wants to get at the causes and so forth, which we sort of touched on here.
Well, let me give one example of this related to what we were just talking about, what I call the global race to the bottom. And what happened in Michigan is just an example. Is right to work is just an example of this. The idea that if we have labor unions and we have union wages, why not let corporations go, or not? Why not let corporations go? Corporations do go where they can undercut labor unions.
They would have a responsibility to do that if they could, if they're on the board of directors, and that would include outsourcing to with containerization and so forth.
Right, but what you said about the board of directors,
they would have that responsibility.
Well, that's right. Now this starts to get though to the structural reform that I call for in my book and that I talk about in my book. Which is the structure of ownership and control of corporations.
Structure of ownership and control. That's something that would interest me very much. I'm very much involved with the thinking of Louis Kelso.
Right. Actually, the ideas that I'm proposing in this book have a relation to the concept of an employee stock ownership plan. So it's consistent with Louis Kelso's ideas, but it takes it to another level. So let me explain though how this addresses the problem that we were just talking about, which is as long as you have corporations that are owned and controlled by people who only care about making money, they're going to utilize every possible opportunity to get lower cost labor if they can. And that's what's happening.
Wouldn't they do that to get, excuse me, all lower cost items and labor parts, everything else they would try to do at the lowest cost they possibly could?
Right. They
not
can.
Only labor, I mean.
Well, not only labor, but I mean, it's one thing, and again, I was talking about manufacturing, okay? It's one thing to introduce a state-of-the-art technology and reduce costs by more efficient manufacturing methods.
Which could do away with labor.
Well,
or could.
Let's put it this way.
That's what Mr. Keynes warned about.
Right. If you look at the development of a very successful industrial economy like Germany, for example, there's been some decline in manufacturing employment. But there's still a robust manufacturing sector. There's still millions of people that earn their living in manufacturing and in related industries in Germany. And so what's happening, though, is that as long as the economy is able to produce efficiently using state-of-the-art automation technology, then the economy is generating an abundance of inexpensive, quality manufactured goods. Yes, which supports the rest of the economy. So, I mean, so for example, I was talking about medicine, right? We talk about healthcare costs, for example.
It's skyrocketing.
So they're skyrocketing, but we want quality healthcare. In order to have quality healthcare, you need sophisticated imaging equipment and medical, various medical technologies. We want these things. But this requires manufacturing. Someone has to manufacture
those surgical tools.
And that's what Germany is one of the leaders in the manufacturing of this type of equipment. So there's a future in manufacturing. And just because the manufacturing sector gets smaller, it doesn't mean it becomes less important. It enables the other sectors of the economy to become more advanced and more developed. And employment will then open up in other parts of the economy where So, for example, in healthcare, you know, we want people working in healthcare. We want equipment in healthcare. But in order to contain those costs, we need to be able to produce quality manufactured goods and machinery and state-of-the-art equipment at low cost. And in order to do that, the United States needs a robust manufacturing sector. And this is why our economy is faltering right now, because our corporations have abandoned the U.S. economy and have abandoned the middle class, and they're going abroad to produce where they could take advantage of lower cost labor.
Well, there's some transportation things that made that possible. I mean, containerization.
Yes, containerization, certainly.
I had a friend who worked with Henry Bridges. Who's the fellow out on the West Coast that ran the longshoremen? Harry Bridges. He was the one that they all called a communist. He was Australian. They had a really good system out there on the West Coast, these longshoremen. And he wrote a book on, he said the longshoremen got a lot, the actual guys, they used to unload things with sacks of coffee or something like that by physical stevedores. It was hard work and everything. And it was a legitimate union and everything. But then he wrote the book on containerizations. The Mazin company or some big company that would do it. And here you can move massive amounts of things without stevedores. And that he wrote a book on automation displacing the input of production by labor to the productive process, which he saw as a structural thing, as did Lord Keynes. And so it's not as though they say that Mr. Ford, when I was in Detroit, my family, they lived on 16th Street. Mr. Ford used to tinker in their garage when he was about 10 years old before he built the thing. He built an assembly line, and so people had a place to go in order to keep on in the productive process by utilizing their labor as a laborer. But now it's going to where they're going to displace people who are not going to have a place to go by a larger productive capability built, because it builds one upon the other. You get an algorithm that can displace 50,000 people who used to do a thing. It's not going to be taken up positions for them in some service.
There's no doubt.
Structural.
There's no doubt that in the long run, if the economy were being run in a rational manner for the benefit of all.
Wouldn't that be something?
What a concept, right?
Yeah.
But if that were the case, there's no doubt that over a long period of time there would be increases in productivity that would result in a shorter work week, and so that if everyone is to have a piece of the productive economy, we would have to reduce the work week, and it could, you know, from 5 to 3 to 2. We could have a society in which we can produce all the goods and services that we need in a much shorter work week.
If we had an alternative way of distributing effective buying power to the people to clear the market.
It is distribution. It is distribution.
Is that Keynesian then?
Well, it's Keynesian or socialist. You know, I mean, this was utopian socialist, or progressive income tax. I mean, you know, in the 1950s, when the United States was building the interstate highway system, do you know what marginal tax rates on the rich were? The highest
what year?
In the 1950s.
50, that could be up 90%.
Yes, it was 91%. Marginal tax rates were 91%. That was the heyday of the American middle class.
That was Mr. Eisenhower,
Under Eisenhower, that was the heyday of the American middle class. So if we had a truly progressive income tax, and if we had a commitment to quality public goods, I think that the interstate highway system today, we look back and we have some misgivings because of the fossil fuel. You know, the use of carbon fuels and the effect that that's having on climate and global warming. But the lesson from the 1950s is that massive public investment occurred by government. We say government. You know, since Reagan, we've had you know, more than 3 decades of government bashing by the Republican Party.
And it was PAPCO that really was a singular thing, I think.
No, the PAPCO strike was just one part of it. It was really an assault on labor and on the middle class.
Yeah, well, he did that.
By government, by corporations, and the ideology. Americans have been it's been drilled into Americans' heads that government is the problem, it can't do things.
Yeah.
But think of the interstate
Van
highway
Hayek
system.
And all that on the right? Van Hayek
Hayek is one school, but also Milton Friedman, the neoliberal economist, right? And we have right now the economics profession tends to have an uncritical attitude toward this ideology that government is part of the problem, it needs to be downsized as much as possible. But think about the 1950s. I mean, that was the heyday of the American middle class.
Yes, it was
strong. We had strong labor unions paying corporations paying high and rising wages, and we had massive public investment, and the rich were paying 91%. So we know how to operate an economy that works for the middle class. It's just a question now of understanding how we got off track and how we need to get back on track.
Well, that is important. But I can't help thinking there's something to do, possibly. It could be to just the politics or the variegating kind of way of thinking as you move through time and so forth, and unintended things or political things. But on the other hand, it could be structural, and that back in the 50s and 60s, I can remember, 70s, you had the labor, Lane Kirkland, you had the labor unions, Walter Reuther, and they had real clout. They had real clout that they had, and all they would do, A.H. Raskin used to write well on labor issues and so forth for the Times, 40 years, and they would have, and what they would come and argue for, they could have argued for, back again to the displacement of labor. You use the word productivity. It's usually tied into a ratio of labor's contribution to productivity to undergird the assumptions of a labor theory of value that inform much of the left and so forth in order to get a better minimum wage or an increased wage. But they never did take a look at, in a systemic way, the labor people never took into effect that there may be a structural displacement of labor's input in relationship to other parts of production, particularly capital assets and so forth. They could have argued for ownership of the capital instruments that were increasingly responsible for production.
Now we're getting to something. Okay, now you're getting to something.
Okay.
That is certainly a failure of the labor movement, and now we're getting to the kind of structural reforms that I'm talking about in this book, and that Louis Kelso talked about to some extent.
Thank you. He was a voice in the wilderness.
Right. So let's look at the problems that we've been talking about in relation to these structural issues. I started to say that, and you were talking about globalization. You were saying how it was containerization that made that possible.
Well, that's offshoring, yeah.
Yeah, but that's a big part of what I have in mind is shipping production abroad. Now it's not only is it manufacturing, now it's even services.
Yeah, so, that's true.
It's a computer programming, phone customer service is all being done in lower wage countries, right?
Yeah.
So this idea of shipping production to low wage parts of the world, it's not just because of technology such as containerization. It's the ownership and control of corporations by people who only care about making money.
Well, haven't the director, isn't that something that Marx would have laid down, or wouldn't that be?
Yes, Marx, I'm not the first to think of this.
Or the feudal lords, the serfs might have had that thing against the crowned heads of Europe.
Right.
Always, right. Or the Rome, or Nebuchadnezzar, for crying out loud. I mean, it's always been a few people own and control everything, and people are mostly like serfs on a feudal estate.
Right, and what Marx said, and I borrow some ideas from Marx. I don't think any intelligent person in the present time can afford to not borrow some ideas.
Yeah, he had such a sense of social concern.
He was a seminal thinker.
For social justice,
Well, not only for social justice, but also about how the industrial economy works. Okay. And so this idea, and this gets to what you're saying about that the technology, that capitalism, Marx lauded capitalism for creating the kind of technology that could eradicate scarcity, that could make general prosperity possible. But what prevented capitalism from delivering on that promise to ordinary people, to the majority of people, was the fact that corporations are owned and controlled by people who only care about making money. Now, look at the contrast, and this gets to what you're saying about labor. Had the labor movement, had labor talked about ownership and control of corporations,
they would have had to have a vision of something other than pitching their labor as their bargaining point.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. Now, in this book, I talk about the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation.
Thank you. It's growing by leaps and bounds.
That's right. That's one model of worker ownership and control.
Vast,
right? And then I talk about another model of worker ownership and control, which has some similarities to the ESOPs, to Louis Kelso's ESOPs, but it goes beyond it. Let me just say very briefly what I have in mind. It would be a grand bargain that we could go to corporations and we can say, look, you want to get rid of the corporate income tax, do you? Well, how about this? Instead of paying 30% of revenues in a corporate income tax, and if they were paying what they should be paying, it would be about 30%. Instead of paying 30% of revenues in your corporate revenues in a corporate income tax, how about instead you don't pay any corporate income tax and you create equity of comparable of equivalent value for your workers. You give your workers equity in the company equivalent to 30% of revenues that you would be paying for the corporate income tax. Now, instead of that instead of that money going to the state, it goes to the workers. Two things come out of this.
You have to have a period of payback. I mean, a period of payback, because what you're talking about is making spell it out. I had an idea. But
workers would have stock. It wouldn't be stock that trades in the open market. It would be held by the workers, but it could not be
binary stock.
I'm not sure what the technical term for that would be, but it would be stock that would not trade in the open market, so it would not dilute the value of existing stock that the outside shareholders had. But workers would now have a share in the profits, but even more importantly, they would have representatives on the board of directors, and they would start to have input in the governance of the corporation. So the ownership and control of the corporation would be transformed by this arrangement, and now instead of a corporation looking only how it's going to maximize profits for outside shareholders, now it has to reckon with its workers as a stakeholder. And instead of shipping production abroad, it can now compete against low-wage labor because it's empowered its workers. It's not paying a corporate income tax. It gives it a cash advantage vis-a-vis corporations that continue in the old way. And so now you have a new type of corporation that's going to be empowered, that's empowering its workers, that has a lower, that doesn't pay a cash outlay for corporate income tax. Therefore, it's capable of competing against low-wage parts of the world and still doing right by its workers.
There's a lot
that's how the middle class can fight back if it can get arrangements like that.
That's a whole series of interrelated things that have to take place in order for that to occur.
Well, not really. It's a very simple idea.
You think so?
It's just an option. It's just a public policy option. You say you create an option and you say to a corporation, look, you can keep doing what you're doing, but you're going to have to pay 30% of revenues in corporate income tax.
Or maybe 40.
Well, even if it's 30, no more loopholes. You're going to pay 30%. But here's an option. Instead of paying 30% corporate income tax, you create equity of equivalent value for your workers. Then you don't pay the corporate income tax, but you create equity for your workers, and the workers have a representatives on the board of directors. That's a simple idea. It's a very, very simple idea.
Yeah, but to get workers on the board of directors as opposed to the way board of directors are connected now is a pretty big jump for the people who have got a inside track on getting their nephew as a board of directors member or friend over at Chase
Corporations today are so corrupt.
Yeah, well,
so corrupt that the majority of corporations are not going to be interested in such an arrangement. However, here's the interesting part. If you create this option, the few corporations that are enlightened enough and non-corrupt enough to embrace this, and if the existing shareholders, if they actually had real control of their corporation and it wasn't a corrupt board and a even more corrupt CEO running the company.
I was saying there's a lot of changes you're inputting to this idea.
But look at how easily this would occur if once you create this legal option for corporations,
Yeah.
the ones that take advantage of it are going to have a competitive advantage over those corrupt, dysfunctional corporations, and it creates a race to the top. Now those corrupt and dysfunctional corporations are going to be driven out of business by these new corporations in which their workers are empowered, they have lower, they're not paying corporate income tax. So those corporations can actually outcompete those dinosaurs that are clinging to the past. And that's a race to the top. Just instead of having a race to the bottom where workers have to compete with workers in Indonesia in order to find the lowest bidder. No, now it's going to be corporations will have to compete by empowering their workers and by reducing their cash liabilities, by getting rid of the corporate income tax and empowering their workers. The ones that do that, the corporations that do that, are going to have a competitive advantage. And that then forces the dinosaurs to get with the program or go out of business.
It's a
race to the top. We need a race to the top.
A race to the top. It's
not to be confused with Obama's miserable education policies.
That's another subject. But that's a very interesting kind of model and idea and way of thinking like that. You know, that it could be realized. What would be required? It would have to be some sort of a movement among the which elements of society? Where is the problem? Is it at the level of intellectual theorizing? Is it our intellectual leadership, which has been co-opted? The whole society seems to have been co-opted. Where would the impetus for such a thing happen? Labor unions are bargaining down now. They seem to have no power. They're being, do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
So where would one begin?
Right, very good question. Well, look, labor unions can play a pioneering role in this. However, labor has to start they have to start to think out of the box. As long as they are thinking in terms of collective bargaining, and there are some unions that are going to always have collective bargaining. For example, public employees are going to need collective bargaining because the public employees cannot own public entities. Right? So that's where collective bargaining.
I don't think the trend is very good in that regard. I mean, it seems to me they're voting. You know, the trend of the society. There's maybe you want to reverse the trend that you see. Obviously,
some unions are always going to need collective bargaining, public unions, but the private sector unions need to start to think out of the box, and they need to start to think, what does a worker-owned and controlled entity look like?
Worker-owned and controlled.
Worker-owned and controlled.
Owned and controlled.
Owned and controlled by
I know. It comes out trippingly after owned and controlled. Does owned and controlled go together at the hip? Are they joined at the hip irrevocably by the laws of physics or something?
They're not. And in fact, you can have worker ownership without control. Now, this gets more to the ESOPs that we were talking about.
Or ESOP. But remember, Lewis, if I may, Lewis, he passed 91 and everything, but you know, he had not only ESOPs, but he had also ways for getting general citizens' ownership of the capital assets that are producing wealth. Beyond just the employee stock ownership plans. That was a model, but that was the tip of the iceberg of just getting a whole other way of distributing, of two things, forming capital and also of distributing demand. So it's a larger thing, because then it would be citizens' ownership.
If you have,
rather than
citizen ownership, if you have citizen ownership, or if you have pension funds, for example,
pension funds are
what
huge.
you have are the ownership becomes so diffuse among so many stockholders that the effective governance of the corporation passes to the management of the corporation, which represents the board of directors, and this is where the corruption comes in. This is where the corruption in corporate governance comes in. So how do we get out of that corrupt crony capitalism? We need a concentrated block of ownership by the workers who work in the company. And bigger than the ESOPs, we're talking about now a third of the corporate revenues would go into equity, right? And so if you have workers as a single ownership block in a corporation,
that'd be a pretty big block,
It would be a big block. They would have representatives on the board of directors, and then workers begin to have input into management the way they do, say, in Germany, which is an extremely successful...
They do. It's worked in Germany that way?
Oh, yeah, it's an extremely successful industrial model that you have in Germany.
Germany is leading the pack over there in Europe.
Yes,
yeah.
And the Mondragon cooperatives are the most successful
talk to that about it. Spell it out for the audience. They may not be aware.
Okay, so...
It goes back to the Spanish Civil War days.
Yes, back in the... country, in the actually, beginning with the Spanish Civil War, this priest, Jose Maria Arizmendi, and the Basques were on the side of the Republicans, of the democratic forces in the Spanish Civil War. So they kind of the church went with the Franco regime, but this group of this particular priest, Jose Maria Arizmendi, was controversial with the church because he fought on the side of the democratic forces.
Okay.
After the war, he had some of his students. He formed, during the war, he formed a technical institute to train unemployed youth in his Basque community in technical, giving them some kind of technical skills, like a community college type arrangement.
That's west of Barcelona. I was associated with Barcelona, but it's over in Basque Country, right?
It's in the Basque region.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And then after the war, some of his students that had gone to this technical institute wanted to form an enterprise, and they wanted to make a kerosene stove. That would be their product.
Yeah.
And they started to build this. They started to manufacture these kerosene stoves, and the enterprise was successful. This was the first Mondragon cooperative. It was owned and controlled by the workers. Decisions were made equally. They shared the profit. They shared the losses. That was the first Mondragon cooperative. Well, this model was so successful that today there are over 260 of these enterprises. The maximum size of the Mondragon cooperatives is 500 because they need to be, if they get any bigger than that, they cannot be effectively controlled by their workers. They need to be small enough that decision-making can be done in a democratic manner.
And they stick with that, right?
That's a rule. If it gets bigger than 500, it has to split and they have to form
become another one. Yeah, right.
That's right. So it's capped at 500, which makes it possible for the workers to control the enterprises.
Okay. Okay.
And
work conditions as well as structural
policies.
They
make all the decisions. They make all the decisions. They even determine the salaries. Okay. Now, in Mondragon, it's done in a democratic manner, and in the Mondragon cooperatives, the ratio of the highest paid member to the lowest paid member is on average 5 to 1.
5 to 1. That's just about like America, isn't it?
Right. Like 200 to 1, right? Like the 200 to 1?
Yeah, right.
So, but then, now, interestingly enough, compare the failure rate of Mondragon enterprises. Since the 1950s, when they started picking up, they were being produced, they developed many of these enterprises. Of the 260 enterprises that have been created since the 1950s, only 4 have failed.
Is that a fact?
Only 4 enterprises
That's an incredible track record.
That's right. Compare that to the startup rate of enterprises in the United States. Private enterprises in the United States fail at a rate of about 70% within 10 years.
Is that right? Yeah, okay.
So this works. This is a model that works.
Yeah, it has worked.
It has worked.
Are there others that are modeled on it, or are there others that are close to it, or is this because that's always quoted, particularly in this age?
There are hundreds or thousands of worker-owned enterprises that are successful. And
that's encouraging, is it not?
Right. My wife and I buy Alvarado Street Bread, which is a worker-owned cooperative from California, and it's a sprouted grain bread. It's a very healthy kind of bread. That's completely worker-owned and controlled. There are plenty of organizations like this, but Mondragon is the most successful of any. They're federated into what's now called the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, and collectively, there's over 100,000 workers that are enrolled in these cooperatives, and collectively, their net revenues are in excess of $20 billion US.
Wow. Okay. Why do I have it?
They're one of the biggest manufacturers of appliances and industrial components in Europe.
Yeah, I have it associated with Barcelona. Am I off base on that?
No, it's the Basque region.
In Basque more, okay.
Right.
And it's also, aren't there people who are picking up on that here in the United States that are following that model?
Yes, now this gets to labor unions, okay?
It's like
now here's
metastasizing. I mean, to use
good way.
That's
the wrong connotation.
Yeah, I know.
I like the idea.
Yeah.
So, no, but this is an example of forward-thinking labor unions, okay? The United Steelworkers in California are forming a Mondragon cooperative in cooperation with Mondragon, with the existing Mondragon cooperatives, because this is, like I said, they really know how to do this. I mean,
now, how about it being a citizen thing rather than a workers thing? If only to get away from, if that's the right term, I don't know, just thin ice here. But the left, or the progressives, and God bless Karl Marx and the people who are concerned for the least among us, has been a horrible kind of injustice and characteristic of virtually all of human history, with very few exceptions and so forth. But this idea also, Mr. Keynes saying, we're getting away from the idea of the labor theory of value. The labor unions had been advancing how important the labor was to the productive process. Productivity is usually measured, is it not, in a ratio with labor's contribution. But you've got things that are coming up, self-sustaining, automated systems that are tremendously productive of goods and services, automation, that sort of thing, which doesn't require, and Lord Keynes is warning about structural unemployment that's going to be coming, so that we have to have some way of having a society where the citizens are given an alternative, and in the way the capital is formed or the investment is made by something other than past savings in the future earnings of a good venture that can be seen and so forth, but does not require labor input to production. We have to get general and then have a way of distributing the buying power to the people if the people are not going to be needed as laborers in a productive process that is becoming automated and is a trend that can be seen into the future. How do we deal with that larger issue?
This is really a great question. And again, the way I think about this, I think about it as extending democracy. How do we extend democracy? Because one of the pitfalls of traditional socialism, certainly you saw that in the Soviet Union, but even to some extent,
did away with private property.
Well, they did away with private property, but they replaced it with control by the state.
Nomenclatura, and all power in the hands of the state. There's
So that, I mean, there is some role for public ownership of public state ownership of corporations. For example, banks. It would really be nice to have banks nationalized. Now, that's obviously a very controversial idea in the United States. We don't even have to go there.
That didn't even come up in 2008 in some of the discussions that came up to all that nonsense that went on in 2008?
Well, I think it was really unconscionable that those banks were not at least reorganized by government. The government should have at least temporarily, at least temporarily nationalized those banks.
They just got off scot-free.
And imposed the costs on the investors. Those were the ones.
Instead of putting people out of their homes, about 14 million.
But that's the way capitalism is supposed to work. You make a bad bet, you're supposed to pay the price. You don't get bailed out by the taxpayer.
Anyway, I didn't want to steer you.
Okay, but the point though is that you want government to play some kind of role in this. And in fact, in this worker ownership scheme, we also talk about having government as a partial owner, so that you would have maybe 10% of the stock could be owned by government. But what does that mean? It means the state. It means the Treasury or the Federal Reserve. So the question remains, though, how do we make the society democratic? How do we make it more democratic?
Really effectively, because
the state, you don't want something like what happened in the Soviet Union, where the state had everything and the people had no real power.
That's right.
So how do we do this? Now, this is where I take a leaf out of the Occupy movement. The Occupy movement is rediscovering the principle of direct democracy. The idea that people can, and as in the case of the Mondragon cooperatives, with 500 members, is small enough that the workers can actually actually control the workplace democratically. That's a example of direct democracy. Now, Occupy try to make decisions like that in local groups where they're small enough to have a general assembly.
The assembly, yeah.
Right, like a Greek polis.
Yeah.
How do we do this on a large scale?
Yeah.
That's the real question. And here's my suggestion that I talk about in this book. We can take a series of reforms of the kind we're talking about. Worker ownership and control of corporations. In the book I talk about a Green New Deal that would be a massive public investment in green technology. We can talk about demilitarizing, where we take all these resources away from a bloated war economy that's not really creating security for ordinary people, and use that money for programs that really would prevent violence, like mental health and wellness programs that could intercept troubled people that have been, like, we have this epidemic of mass shootings in this country, and yet we don't provide enough resources for mental health and wellness programs that could, for the people that need them, that could actually prevent violence. So there's all these kinds of policy reforms that can be put into legislation. Don't wait for Congress to produce this legislation. It will never happen.
It will never happen.
It will never happen.
Congress
because Congress is beholden to right-wing ideologues and and corrupt corporate CEOs and predatory investors, and we know how corrupt our system of political economy is, so we cannot expect that to come out of Congress.
Did you know Seymour?
However,
did you know Seymour Melman?
Oh, certainly.
Seymour Melman is a great guy. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I cite Seymour Melman. I refer to Seymour Melman quite a bit in this book, actually.
Yeah. Do you? Good. Yeah, he's a great guy. I like him a lot.
Yeah, he was a pioneer.
He also picked up on Kelso.
Right, that's right. Well, he was a pioneering theorist of what he called the permanent war economy, and also industrial democracy that we were talking about.
I heard tell that Eisenhower warned against the military-industrial scientific community.
Right, but before, I see we're running out of time.
Yeah, that's right. We got 5 to 10 minutes.
Oh, we have 10 more minutes?
Yeah, about 10.
Okay, good. So let me just say that what we need is a way to get this program of reform enacted into law. Don't wait for Congress to. Well, you
said the Congress is unapproachable.
Don't wait for the Congress to draft the law. It will never happen.
You need a movement. Is what you're talking
we need a movement. Laws can be written by people. We can get a think tank, for example. I'm hoping.
There you go. And I was talking about intellectuals before, or even scientists.
I'm hoping to meet with Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia, the Earth Institute, and this month sometime, and I want to propose to him that the Earth Institute could draft Green New Deal legislation. We could actually draft legislation to create a green infrastructure, renewable energy, public transportation. It would cost about $1.5 trillion, which may sound like a lot of money, but compared to our military economy and all the corporate welfare and all the tax breaks for the rich, it's something that we can afford. That's something that we can afford that. And it would be drafted by a think tank, a public interest think tank, and then we go to the people with this agenda and we say, look, do you want a Green New Deal? Do you want jobs? Do you want to avert climate change? Hurricane Sandy, there's going to be more where that came from. There's going to be droughts like we had in 2012 if we don't stop climate change, right? So we go to the public, and the masses of people historically have been rational in recognizing the need for these kinds of reforms. If you look at public opinion data, the problem is not the people. Ordinary people are very progressive and enlightened when it comes to understanding.
If they're presented with something that makes sense.
If they're given good information, they make good decisions.
So it might be, I asked you before, where do you begin? It might begin with the intellectuals. The intellectuals have been co-opted. Bucky Fuller, again, we talked about him. He said that they're not worried at all. Let's just be a little playful here. The pirates that will run the world. It's always been a few people who run everything. Everybody else wallowing around in the mud. And they're just doing the leading of it. But they're not at all worried about the dullards that are there. They're worried about the smart ones. And what they did, they set out consciously to develop graduate schools, to get the intellectuals coming along, particularly the smart ones, so specialized out on some special field of narrow concentration of attention, specialization, as that they will never think systems or systems thinking, and there's practically nowhere, there is no university that has a program of everything. You know, across, you know, systems are systems are systems, so they've co-opted the intellectual community. So where are you going to get people in the intellectual community that aren't interested only in their narrow way of thinking, and they've been divided to think the thing. The market is all down to where specialization is the way to make money. You can't be thinking, there's nobody thinking systems of systems, except maybe that could be reinvigorated, maybe with the internet or some autodidactic given thing, other than the academia, the setting of academia, which is galloping towards specialization. Do you understand?
I totally agree with you, and I think that if we just wait for universities to come up with these kinds of solutions,
it'd be a long wait.
That's not likely either,
Because they're just getting their tenure and their
there's a value to specialization, but we absolutely need the kind of systems thinking that you're talking about, and that's what I try to do, by the way, in this book.
This is a systems thinking thing.
This is based on systems thinking. I look at the economy as a system. I look at the environment as a system. And for example, manufacturing is part of an ecology of the economy. You have to think of the economy as an ecological system, where different parts of the economy perform different functions.
Could I suggest to you one place where we might think beyond the academia? How about public access cable television that maybe you could join into and give some support to? It might be a place to get the people going, and also some, I got on my site some autodidactic tutorials where people can educate themselves. There may be hope in that, particularly among the young.
There may be, but I want to I just want to...
We only got a couple minutes left. Get it in quick
now.
The
last thing is that if you can produce a bill like Green New Deal legislation, and you can get the word out to people, and public access is one of the ways that that can be done.
Absolutely.
Why can't we have the people enact this directly into law? That would be national direct democracy. And now that's
how are they going to enact it into law when you can't?
Well, we have
referendums. You shocked me with your outrageous thoughts.
We have referendums. We have national referendums.
Not in New York. They do in California.
No, we do, So it's a short step to the kind of constitutional reform that we can go directly to the people. When you look at something like the Occupy movement, or you look at the kind of militant labor movement that we had in the 1930s, it's that kind of mass movement that forces the Washington elite to enact these kinds of things.
It would take a movement or something like that.
It would take a movement.
Yeah, and we got to get some intellectuals. And
the elite have to get the message that if they won't enact this into law, the people will enact it directly into law.
No, I think the intellectuals ought to get it. You know, somebody ought to write a book. I got a title for a book. You know, somebody ought to write a book. The Middle Class Fights Back, How Progressive Movements Can Restore Democracy in America, and put that sucker out into the thing through television on public access. Brian, thank you very much.
I have a website, by the way, called middleclassfightsback.org.
Yeah, middleclassfightsback.org. You've requested Brian D'Agostino. Thank you very much for viewing. We invite you to tune in. We'll be coming back again tomorrow. That's it for now. Brian, all the best. This is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. We've got to do more work together.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for viewing. We'll be coming back again tomorrow. Thank you.